There's a misunderstanding whereby Americans think that they can't go overseas and reduce their taxes, that they're just somehow stuck. And I'm going to tear that misconception apart. The truth is that Americans do have options to legally reduce their taxes. I'm going to go through 3 different options today. And I think with this misconception that, hey, Americans are just stuck, you can't do anything about reducing your taxes, comes from the fact that the U.S. has what's called citizenship-based taxation and this misconception around what that means and how it works. Citizenship-based taxation, which the U.S. is essentially the only country that fully does this on a full scale, means that not only if you live in the U.S. do you pay tax on your worldwide income. That's what's called residential tax. If you live in the United States and you have an investment in Singapore, you pay tax in Singapore, but then you pay tax on anything that Singapore didn't tax. If the U.S. rate is higher, you're going to pay the additional in the U.S. And so you may not pay double tax, but you're going to pay the full U.S. tax rates. There's really no tax advantages. A lot of Western countries have that residential form of taxation. What the U.S. does and says, well, that's great, but if you move to Singapore and have investments in Singapore, we're still going to tax you because you are a U.S. person. It's not just U.S. citizens, it's also U.S. green card holders, any what's called a U.S. person. And so if you have a green card and somehow you can spend the majority of your time outside of the United States and keep your green card, you would still fall into this trap as well. And so people think, well, citizenship-based taxation, no matter where I go, I'm going to be taxed. What can I do about it? And I saw some comments recently on social media saying, hey, it's difficult because you have to give up your citizenship if you don't want to pay taxes living overseas. And then someone said, oh, there's a penalty for leaving. And there's currently a hold on even starting that process. And then you can never come back to the country. And it's like, no, none of those things are true. Can you give up your citizenship and totally divorce yourself from the tax laws? Yeah, you can. Or if you're a green card holder, you can give up your green card. If you can remove that U.S. person status, which for most people is citizenship, if you renounce your citizenship, then you no longer have the conditions that come from citizenship-based taxation. You're no longer a citizen. They no longer care what you do. If you have a second citizenship, or if you obtain a second citizenship, let's say by a Caribbean or Malta or some kind of citizenship program out there, maybe you've got a family member who came from another country, you can qualify for citizenship by descent, maybe you've been living overseas for a number of years, whatever, you can then give up your U.S. citizenship. That is one of the 3 options. Is there a penalty for leaving? Well, there's an exit tax. We've covered that in separate episodes. It's not nearly as draconian as people think it is, quite frankly. People have this conception that they just take some fraction of what you own. That's really not how it works. Can you come back to the country? Well, depending on which passport you have, you may need to get a visa, and maybe that has some challenges, but you also may not have to get a visa. So that goes back to your citizenship strategy. Do you see why we have a holistic service here at Nomad Capitalist where we do multi-jurisdictional tax, immigration, and investment planning? What no other accountants or attorneys do, because you've got to figure out the whole plan if you want to reduce your taxes, if you want to keep your lifestyle. But don't listen to this, that you can't leave the country or you can never come back if you give your citizenship, or you still owe taxes if you give your citizenship. This stuff is not true. And so I recently posted on social media, hey, you guys are you're not telling the truth about how this works. Let's go through the options, because here's what people do. They look at the headline tax rate, they look at the headline of citizenship-based taxation, and they say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. The same way that people look at it and say, oh, Italy has crazy high tax rates. Well, Italy does have crazy high tax rates. You know what Italy also has? They also have a lump sum tax program where you can go and pay 100,000 euros flat and make all the money that you want. Somehow the headline tax rates no longer matter, because you as a foreigner, as someone who hasn't lived in Italy, can move there. And Italy's far from the only country. But I use Italy as an example where you think, oh, this is a country with bad taxes. Well, maybe not for you. And if you're an American, maybe those tax rates won't apply for you. The worst position to be in as an American is to be an employee, because you have the least control over how to structure your income. If you work for a U.S. company, they may want to pay you from the U.S. company. It just doesn't have a lot of flexibility. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're an investor, you've got a lot more flexibility, especially if you have a business. So the first thing you can do is you can move to Puerto Rico. You've probably heard about Puerto Rico's Act 60, formerly known as Act 20 and 22. This is where you can go and you can take part in one of 2 acts or both of 2 acts. You can go under the Investor Act, where basically you're saying, hey, if I have capital gains, whether it's from a business sale, from a cryptocurrency sale, from various different kinds of more passive income, trading, what have you, I'm going to be taxed, generally speaking, at 0 on that. If I already have some assets coming in, I'm going to figure out what that's worth, how long I've owned them, when I come in. I'm not going to just escape tax on what I've already built up in the U.S., but going forward, I'm going to have potentially zero tax on those passive assets. If I want to run my business from Puerto Rico, I'm going to pay as little as 4% plus whatever the tax rate is on a fair market salary that I take out. And so I'm going to pay 4, 5, 6% maybe all told in that business. If I'm working with a business that's already in the U.S., maybe I need to do some transfer pricing back and forth to where some of the businesses in the U.S. I'm paying U.S. rates, most of the businesses in Puerto Rico with me. I mean, there's a number of different things you have to look at here. But you can move to Puerto Rico and pay, generally speaking, 0 to single-digit tax rate for either passive income or active income. You're going to spend a majority, potentially a plurality of your time, just shy of a majority of your time living in Puerto Rico. So you do need to be there. You do need to somewhat limit your time in the U.S., but you still get to keep your U.S. citizenship. You still get to go back to the U.S. for a decent amount of time every year, but you've got to be in Puerto Rico. That's the first option, to reduce your taxes as an American, and you're still technically in the United States. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. The second option to reduce taxes as a U.S. citizen is to expatriate. Now, this could be giving up your citizenship if you are a citizen. It could be relinquishing your green card if you are a green card holder. And there are rules that long-term green card holders have additional tax consequences. And so if you haven't had your green card for that long, you want to look at what's my long-term prognosis for either naturalizing or for maintaining my green card, because your tax rules are going to be stricter the longer that you hold it. But let's just say you're a citizen of the United States and you want to give up that citizenship. Again, you're going to need some other citizenship. You're going to want to plan of where to live. You're going to need a whole number of things to shape your post-U.S. life. But obviously, if you give up your U.S. citizenship, we've made plenty of episodes on that you can find here in the channel, you are no longer going to be tied to the U.S. tax laws. Now, if you're making all of your money from a company in the U.S., you want to move the company overseas. If you're making all your money from U.S. real estate, well, I mean, you're going to be subject to those rules. You may have depreciation that reduces the tax dramatically, but it's still going to be U.S. taxable. So you don't want to have stuff sitting in the U.S. and saying, well, hey, I'm not in the U.S., I'm not a U.S. citizen. Well, certain U.S. assets may still be subject to tax. If you're earning dividends, for example, from U.S. companies, that may be subject to tax. So expatriation doesn't clear out all kinds of income, but if you've got just a business that you can move anywhere you want, if you're investing in property overseas, if you're investing in crypto, expatriating gives you the flexibility that now you no longer have to play by any of the U.S. tax rules, and you get to do what everyone else in the world gets to do, which is leave your country's tax net. They don't have to give up their citizenship, but you get to choose, hey, I'm going to go get a residence permit in Dubai, and I'm going to be a citizen of Dominica, and I'm going to bank over here, and I'm going to run my company over here. And you get to kind of figure out where all those pieces of the puzzle are going to go. The U.S. is just no longer part of that puzzle. Now, if you don't want to move to Puerto Rico, which does require a lifestyle change, it's basically one island, or a couple islands, but basically one island. Or if you don't want to give up your citizenship, then you're left with the option of simply going offshore. Now, this works a lot better for entrepreneurs who run an active business because there are provisions in the U.S. code, such as the foreign earned income exclusion. It's earned income that you make while you are overseas, foreign earned income exclusion. So where you can, for example, on a salary, no matter where that salary comes from, whether it's freelance income, any kind of normal job, any kind of business where you're paying yourself a salary, you can take out in 2022 $112,000 tax-free. And if you structure that properly, you can take it out free of all taxes, including Social Security, including Medicare. If you structure your exit from the U.S. properly, you're keeping your citizenship, but just you're going to be physically moving out of the U.S. You can make sure you have no state tax, you have no federal tax. It's zero on pretty close to about $10,000 a month when you kind of work out the numbers depending on your particular situation. It's probably going to be around $10,000 a month that you can take out. Now, if you run a business, you get to control the business to where you're not only an employee of your business, but you're also the owner of the business. So you pay yourself as a salary as the employee, but you as the owner of the business get to structure that business properly. And so if you move the business offshore, there are ways where you can reduce the tax to anywhere from 0% to somewhere in the single or very low double digits. And so it starts to get more complex. When people say, oh, Andrew, the Nomad Capitalist, gave up his U.S. citizenship because he didn't want to pay tax, the reality is in my current life circumstances, if I were still a U.S. citizen, my tax bill on my entire business globally would be zero. So why would I give up my citizenship for tax? I've talked about why I give up my citizenship, and certainly, not having to file so many forms, not having to report all my bank accounts, not having to worry about how I take money and when I take money, and just having more freedom. That's interesting. But there are ways to be a U.S. citizen, to run a business overseas and pay zero in tax. And I'm not talking $112,000 a year. Maybe you've got a business that's $10 million a year. Now, depending on your circumstances, depending on what you're willing to do, you may need to pay a little bit of something, but it's still going to be dramatically lower. Let's say you've just got a single member LLC. Let's say you've got an S Corp. Most people are going to save anywhere from 50 to 80% by going overseas. And so when you go overseas, I'm not talking about moving to France. I'm talking about moving to generally speaking, a tax neutral country. If you're an American, the easiest countries that you're going to go to are going to be tax neutral. So they could be tax free. They could be countries that don't tax your foreign income. They could be countries that have exemptions. And so there are countries that do have taxes, but they don't tax foreign income, or they don't tax foreign corporations. There's generally some planning to do there. Or maybe they won't tax you for the first 10 years. I'm not talking about Portugal. Programs like Portugal's NHR are a little bit more difficult to work for Americans because you're generally satisfying 3 different jurisdictions that all need to be taken care of, and it becomes a little bit of a mess. It's doable, but it requires more work. It requires you to make more adjustments on a lifestyle basis, and it requires you to pay a little bit more. But theoretically, you can go to Portugal, you can go to Italy, and you can basically push some of the money that you're paying there towards your U.S. tax bill to where you're going to pay something somewhere, and you can choose where you pay that. But if you're a U.S. citizen and you have a business, and you've got a big business, you can reduce the taxes on that substantially by operating the business offshore. Are you going to have quite as much control over what you do with the money as someone who cut their ties with the U.S. for good? No, you are not. But you're going to get to keep the U.S. citizenship, and you're going to be able to spend, anywhere from a month to a couple of months every year in the United States. There are going to be conditions on what you do maybe when you're in the United States. So there's always conditions on this stuff. So don't take this as like tax advice. Obviously, this is why we have a business here at Nomad Capitalist and why we work with various high-level CPAs and lawyers who, in addition to our in-house team, are very well knowledgeable about what you need to do for your specific situation. That's what we help people with. But there are ways for you to reduce it. Please don't fall into this trap where you say, I'm an American. It's nice for the rest of you who get to go overseas and go to Dubai and go everywhere else. Again, if you are an employee, I've told this story for many, many, many years. I've had a friend for years, lives in the UAE, makes about $1 million a year with salary and bonus. He just pays because the UAE doesn't ask him to pay. He gets the foreign earned income exclusion. He did everything to get that foreign earned income exclusion to where that first, again, close to $10,000 a month is 000 across the board. On the rest, he just pays because the UAE is not taking anything. So he just pays the US a whole bunch of money. For him, he has other investments and other things going on in his life that it's like, all right, whatever, it's worth the cost. But that's the worst situation to be in. If you have some kind of control over your investments or particularly over your business, you can structure something anywhere from 0 to a very low tax rate. Depending on your situation, you can keep more of your own money. And you know what? Listen, it is more difficult. There are more hoops to jump through. There is more planning, as opposed to everyone else who just needs to figure out, hey, how do I leave the Canadian system? And once that's solved for, as long as you don't get back into the Canadian system by doing something that goes against what you did to get out of the system, then you're free as a bird and you can keep your Canadian passport, Australian, German, whatever, travel the world on that and live somewhere else and choose your own tax rate. As an American, you're always factoring in that U.S. tax residence that you're carrying around with you like a ball and chain. But there are plenty of exemptions and exclusions and ways that you can work around that. Are they trying to raise the rates and make it more difficult? Yeah, a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. Sure, it may become progressively more expensive for some people to be U.S. entrepreneurs overseas. Hey, if they made it 15 or 20%, a lot of people are still going to save a lot of money. I mean, that could still be multi-millions of dollars of savings. You can do that as an American. Those are the 3 ways to do it.